There's a good chance that at some point in your life, you've been in a situation where you didn't communicate as well as you should have.
What do you want?
It's not that simple.
This could be in a relationship, at work, with family, or even some type of inner dialogue that you have with yourself. The one thing that nobody is talking about though is the concept of nonviolent communication, or NVC. It's an ideology designed to increase empathy and improve the quality of life of those who use it. Think about the last big disagreement that you had with somebody. What was it about? You may not remember all the details of why you were upset, but you definitely remember how you felt. You might remember how tense your body was, how warm you became, or just how ready you were to say hurtful things just so the other person could feel the same pain that you felt. In this video, we're going to talk about what it takes to become a compassionate communicator. We'll talk about how to react when people say hurtful things like, "You're the most selfish person I've ever met." You'll learn why you should keep your observations separate from your evaluations, and why you shouldn't immediately blame your partner for leaving dirty socks lying around the house, which I may or may not be guilty of. And with that, let's dive in. So first and foremost, our ability to live in a society is dictated on how well we can communicate with others.
Nobody's civil anymore!
Unfortunately, sometimes we use language that cuts the flow of communication, and even worse, hurts the people that we're communicating with. This happens when our words put up walls instead of bridges. For example, calling a friend selfish for taking the last piece of cake that you wanted is a statement that can create defensiveness. Sometimes a simple question about their motivation can help find a solution. This kind of language also removes us from being our most compassionate selves. It makes us more violent as individuals and societies. There's a connection between language and violence, and it's been studied by University of Colorado professor O.J. Harvey. He studied world literature from different countries and looked for words that judged people, like good or bad. He found that countries with more judgmental words in their literature also had a higher number of violent accidents. Harvey concluded that those societies reinforced the idea that bad individuals deserve to be punished, leading to more violent incidents. But this communication that cuts us off from one another goes beyond good and bad. There's a range of linguistic devices that create gaps between people, one being moralistic judgment. Moralistic judgments typically include insults, criticism, and labels. They imply that a person who is behaving differently than you, according to your value system, is behaving wrongly. Imagine a daughter who's trying to move out of her parents' house, but they don't think that she's ready, and that she might even be putting herself in danger. Instead of trying to understand her point of view, they label her as selfish. Instead of calling her selfish, they could take the time to identify their needs as well as their daughter's, and then once it's all said and done, they could have a compassionate discussion about it. It might turn out that what the parents are really worried about is how much they'll miss their daughter. By using compassionate language, they can bridge their differences instead of alienating each other. Expressing your emotions is hard, especially when they're negative. Luckily, there's a powerful method that can help us here. Like previously mentioned, it's called nonviolent communication, or NVC. The term nonviolence is inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and refers to the natural state of our hearts, free from violence and full of compassion. Communication refers to NVC's conception of language, which defines the relationship we have with others and ourselves. Combined, they create an approach that allows us to be more aware of the words that we say and how we listen to others. NVC allows us to communicate our feelings clearly. It encourages us to observe objectively, identify our needs, and to communicate with compassion. Let's illustrate this point with an example. Imagine you have a little boy named Jim. Now Jim loves his toys so much that he decides that he's going to spread them all over the living room floor. And not for the first time today, but for the third time. You don't immediately yell at him to clean it up. You start by observing the situation. Next, try to sense how you feel when you observe the situation. Are you scared for Jim's safety? Or are you angry that you have to repeat yourself over and over? After a minute, you realize you're frustrated and irritated. You then need to identify the needs that emerge from those feelings. You might need to have an orderly household. But before you say anything, think about how you might be able to convince the person to make your life better without hurting them. When you're ready, form an honest, clear, and compassionate request. Jim, when I see your toys in the living room, I feel frustrated because I need the rooms that we share to be more orderly. Would you be willing to move your toys to your room once you're finished playing? To understand it even further, we need to look at the observation part of the NVC approach. It all starts with being aware of the present moment. Listen to what the other person is saying and ask yourself, how is this affecting my well-being? The next step is to avoid generalizing your arguments and trying to observe only specific situations. Instead of saying, "You always do this one thing," try referring to a specific moment that upset you. It's also important to know the difference between observation and evaluation. It's kind of like that Oprah meme. Were you silent or were you silenced?
Were you silent or were you silenced?
For many people, making the distinction between observation and criticism can be difficult. The phrase, "my boss is always late," is an evaluation, whereas "my boss will not arrive before 8:30" is more accurate. An observation needs to be specific, which reduces the likelihood of a misunderstanding. They're also free of criticism, which prevents the recipient from getting defensive. Another way of improving observation is to be aware of labeling. If you label people, you'll struggle to relate to a specific situation or person. For example, having the preconception that someone is a liberal or a conservative might cloud your judgment when it comes to tackling certain issues. The problem is you assume what the person is already thinking. After observing, the next step is to observe how we feel. Describing our feelings accurately can be really hard because we rarely need to identify our true emotions. The best way to express ourselves is by being really specific. For example, instead of saying the phrase, "I feel a bit down," try using sharper adjectives instead of the verbs that describe why you feel that way. Are you feeling depressed, regretful, or betrayed? Expanding your vocabulary will help you with expressing your feelings. Being vague is the root of the issue, and pronouns can make things very ambiguous. You might say something along the lines of, "I don't know why everybody hates me," but this doesn't really address the specifics. Instead, try relating your experiences to real people and places. Like yesterday morning, I asked my sister for advice, and she didn't respond. And then the same thing happened with my boss at lunch the next day, and it made me feel really unappreciated. Try to give a narrative of the events and state how you felt as they occurred. You'll also need to learn how to express your vulnerability. Some professions discourage the expression of vulnerability, like lawyers or engineers or the military. Instead of holding your emotions in, use NVC to establish bridges of communication. First, observe. Then, identify your feelings and needs. And lastly, make clear requests. While you're doing this, you also need to be aware that you still need to take responsibility for your feelings. You can do this with others by first recognizing your own needs. While another person can be the stimulus of our feelings, they cannot be the cause. Our reactions determine how we feel about what other people say to us. For example, we naturally have a negative reaction when someone tells us, "You're the most selfish person I've ever met." But let's look at 4 different ways we can react to that statement. 1. You have a negative reaction and you think, "It's all my fault." When you blame yourself, you fail to analyze the root of the message and you don't address the other person's grievance. This might make you feel guilty, low, or even depressed. Number 2, you might become defensive or angry. You might say, "That's a lie. I've always considered your needs." Here, you blame the speaker and again, fail to address the underlying issue. A better reaction would be to vocalize your feelings, saying something like, "I feel dejected when you say I'm selfish because I've been consciously trying to meet your demands." Through this process of verbalization, you can identify your own emotional response and address the reasons behind the conflict. Finally, and ideally, you observe the feelings and the needs of the speaker. You might ask, "Do you think I'm selfish because of a specific action that I've taken? How can I show more consideration for your needs?" Once we understand our reactions and feelings, it's time to figure out what our needs are. Often we blame others for not catering to our needs when we don't even express them in the first place. We might yell at our partners because they're messy and they don't meet our standard of cleanliness. But sometimes we don't communicate that we need the kitchen to be orderly. If we blame them, it's likely that they'll feel guilt and become defensive. Resolving this issue starts with expressing our needs as directly as we can. Now, it's much easier said than done, but nobody out there is a mind reader, and if something is bothering you, you need to speak up. The more direct you are about your needs, the easier it will be for people to meet them in a compassionate way. So if you have a partner that leaves the dirty dishes behind, tell them how it makes you feel, and then offer a solution that works for the both of you. If you don't communicate your needs directly, you're going to cause yourself a lot of pain in the long run. Which brings us to the next point. How do we sincerely communicate our needs once we identify them? Our request should be made to clearly express what we really want and always using positive language. Positive language is when you ask for something to be done, while negative language is when you ask somebody to stop doing something. The latter can be unclear at times and can lead to misunderstandings and confusion. Forming requests into concrete actions is important so others know what they need to do. For example, an employer might want feedback from his employees who are too afraid to speak up. He might say, "Feel free to share your thoughts with me." He wants them to feel free, but he's not saying what actions they can take to feel free. To help them do so, he should make a request using the principles of positive language. Like in this example, "I'd like you to tell me what I can do to help you feel free and make it easy for you to share your thoughts with me." By now we've learned that NVC can help you in your relationships with others, but it also has the power to improve your relationship with yourself. The first step to a better relationship with yourself is realizing when you experience judgmental self-talk. This is the voice in our head that criticizes us for the smallest mistakes. You might hear yourself say, "God, I'm such an idiot," or "Oops, I did it again." Instead of getting trapped in this negative internal dialogue, try to understand and identify the needs that are fueling the self-judgment. Self-judgment, like any other judgment, is the expression of unfulfilled needs. So when you start hearing judgmental self-talk, you should stop focusing on it and start focusing on your unmet needs. If you can learn to connect fully with your unmet needs, you can finally start accepting the fact that you're not perfect. Even though you might regret not being able to fulfill your ideal image of yourself, at least you won't hate yourself for it. None of us can escape the conflicts in our day-to-day lives. Fortunately, the principles of nonviolent communication offer us tools in helping us learn how to resolve them. So to quickly recap, first, establish a human connection. This is the starting point where the involved parties can start to understand the other's feelings and needs. The next step is to ensure the intention comes from an honest place. It has to be clear from the start that the goal is to create a space where everyone can express their needs. This can be achieved by observing feelings, connecting them to both parties' needs, and forming concrete requests. These are then examined with the goal of achieving satisfaction, not compromise. Satisfaction is when both parties' needs are fully met. This system is the key to reducing our interpersonal conflicts and gradually making the world a better place.